So there are a number of connections between the antebellum reform movement, which was really a result of the Second Great Awakening back in the early 1800s, and the Progressive Era. And one bridge between those is, in fact, anti-alcohol. So here, actually, we have a bridge for the Drunkard's Progress, that was as it was known back when it was put out in the antebellum reform effort, from the first glass to the grave. So from step one, a glass with a friend, to step nine, death by suicide. Very macabre sort of progression or devolution. But one of the similar reform foci during these two reform efforts was anti-alcohol. Temperance really means limiting alcohol, whereas the 18th Amendment, which will come really at the end of the progressive era, is in fact the prohibition or almost a total elimination of alcohol. So when we looked at the temperance movement, again, it started a little bit more gradual and ended a little more radical. Was, listen, if we get rid of alcohol or we reduce it at the very least, that's going to help restore order, because there's so many problems that alcohol brings with it. So one is this idea that money is simply lost, that families are poor because, the dad, leaves work, goes to the bar and spends all his money there and spends all his weekends there. So the family loses out in terms financially. But also this idea that when men have alcohol in them, the devil's got them, and it's going to create even more violence. So if we get rid of alcohol or reduce it, we're going to have much more peace and order in the family. And just generally speaking, this was a very much a women's led effort, because they thought that if we can get rid of alcohol or reduce it, we can actually improve our own family lives. Our lives, quality of life will be so much better if our husbands are more sober more of the time. Now, employers also felt the sobriety would be helpful, because if people came to work drunk, or the effects of alcohol still in them, then people aren't going to do as good of a job. There are going to be more accidents. Just generally speaking, everything's not going to go as smoothly. And then there were people that realized, listen, political corruption is born in saloons, because, again, the Tammany Halls of the world, they go and they basically get their votes by, buying people alcohol and really appealing to people who are already a little worked up in the bar. So again, as we're going to look at trying to, limit political corruption, there's a belief that if you get rid of alcohol, they'll go hand in hand. Okay. So the first real sort of organization that we're going to see doing the work in the progressive era actually is formed definitely during the Gilded Age, and that's the Women's Christian Temperance Union, known as the WCTU, and led by a woman named Frances Willard, which was headquartered in Evanston, Illinois. There's actually a dorm named after Frances Willard on Northwestern's campus. Now, Evanston, like most of the North Shore, was dry. Evanston did not allow alcohol until 1972. So when I got there in 1996, it had only had alcohol for about a quarter of a century. In fact, there's a brewery that's now in Evanston called Temperance Brewery, which is, again, sort of ironic, but certainly in the Chicago suburbs right along the lake, definitely Evanston had an outsized influence in terms of making sure that there was no alcohol, which is just an interesting fact that I did not know until I got to Northwestern in 1996. Now, if you're looking at the late 1800s, you can see in 1893 that there aren't that many states that are quote unquote dry. And you can sort of see them sort of almost going right down the middle of the plains. Obviously, Nebraska and parts of Oklahoma are still wet, as they said. But just in less than 2 decades, by 1910, you can see the progress that has been made around the United States. Obviously, places like Chicago, and then the parts of the East Coast that are far more urban, you're not going to see that yet. And the fight is really going to be over the next 10 years, from 1910 to about 1920, how many more states can they get on board? Now, it's very interesting, and I wish I could play video, but I don't really have any. This is Carrie A. Nation, and actually her name was originally Carrie, but she actually changed it sort of for propaganda purposes. This is a 6-foot woman who used to bring her hatchet, her little hand axe, and would go into bars while singing religious songs and would just wreck everything with her hatchet. So that was one way to get rid of alcohol. She was part of what was known as the Anti-Saloon League, that felt like if you could get rid of saloons, that was the solution. And then the Anti-Saloon League and the WCTU, which had much broader reforms, family reforms, more feminist reforms, they came together. And so it moved sort of from this like, let's limit alcohol to let's reduce it or eliminate it altogether. So I do the sign down here, all nations are welcome except Kerry, was the signs that you would see in bars that didn't want their alcohol taken away. So again, you also see the WCTU pledge here. Again, an organization that was very focused on women, and most of the membership was women. Again, with the belief that if we can rid alcohol from our families and from society at large, everything will just be better for everyone. Now, it's important to understand that the real progress starts to come as a result of World War One. So by 1916, 19 states had passed prohibition laws. Again, we don't have 50 states at that time, so it's a little bit closer to 50% than you would think looking at it. But it really was World War One that created this catalyst for sort of pushing prohibition over the edge. Because you have to remember, obviously we haven't studied World War One yet. This is, pro-American nationalism, but also anti-German. We're fighting the Germans, and we're on the side of the English, and the Irish and the English hate each other. So by virtue, we're anti-German and anti-Irish. Well, those are two of the groups going back to the mid, 1800s who'd come here and really enjoyed alcohol as part of their culture. On top of that, you have this idea of self-sacrifice. So if you see this cartoon, you got Uncle Sam, don't waste the fuel. Food will win the war. Don't waste it. Don't waste clothing. It was this whole idea that like, if we waste, we're hurting our soldiers abroad. We need to make sure that all of our energy can be focused to creating stuff for them. And then, of course, you have over here this rubbish, wasted manhood. So anybody who's at the saloon is really not supporting the cause. You're actually not patriotic. And also the idea that grain is used for alcohol, and we want that grain to be able to be sent abroad to our troops and to our allies. So this idea that somehow saloons and alcohol were unpatriotic helped push this movement almost across the finish line. So you can see that 1917, where the United States actually enters the war that year, you've got rural fundamentalism. Again, people that are very much against what's going on in the cities. They think that, literally, the devil is in the city. And again, that's the place where most people are drinking. So they're pushing much more of a prohibition message. You've got, the groups like the WCTU and the Anti-Saloon League that are pushing it. So with that war effort and the other sort of concurrent efforts going on, by 1920, you're going to get the 18th Amendment. That is after the war is over, but it really been pushed during the war. The 18th Amendment is the only amendment that is actually ever rescinded, because prohibition will only last just over a decade before the 21st Amendment sort of swats it down and brings alcohol back. Okay. But I talked about the idea that, alcohol was an impediment to industrial efficiency. Well, let's actually look at working conditions. And one of the places that progressives were very concerned about were the most vulnerable members of society. So whereas Jacob Riis was writing how the other half lived, he certainly did focus on children, but Lewis Hine was focusing specifically on children. And if you look, again, you don't have to look, you'll know this, but children are small and they have small hands. They can get into areas that adults couldn't get into. So, deep into the mines or fixing machines at the mill or in the factories. Now, obviously, that created gruesome injuries. But they were seen as advantageous in that regard. They were also incredibly cheap. So, of course, at Stevenson, we had a number of students in our class that were involved in the amazing production of Newsies. But kids worked also out there selling newspapers on the street. And so you might ask yourself, like, well, why would any self-respecting parent ever let their kid be in these very dangerous, dirty conditions? And the reality is that you could use any money you could get. So actually, the more kids you had, the more mouths you had to feed, but also the more opportunities you had for those kids to go out and help the family. So I wanted to show this video right here on child labor.
In the early 1900s, the general population in those years had very little understanding of what was meant by child labor and child exploitation. kinds of jobs you would find children working in ranged from the mines, the factories, the cotton mills, to working out on the streets selling newspapers. Injuries, even deaths, were very common among children. The parents would often say that they needed the income that their children brought in, that was what allowed them to continue to survive. A number of parents were advocates for child labor, and their children thought that that was the way life was. One of the first things the National Child Labor Committee did was to hire a photographer. They hired Lewis Hine, who was then their photographer for the next 2 decades. They sent him around the country to identify, find, and photograph children in exploitative situations. He promoted himself as a Bible salesman. He said he was bringing his camera along so he could photograph kids reading Bibles. A boy would say he was 13 when in fact he was 11, or a girl would say she was 12 when in fact she might be 9. The photograph is of a young girl, 10 or 11 years old. Her name was Sadie Pfeiffer, at a cotton mill in Lancaster, South Carolina. She's standing in front of a large loom on a long hallway, staring at and working hard on the job of selecting the quality products. She's probably worked most of the night. It's nearing the end of her shift. She stands there, iconic, as a representative of hundreds of other girls who are being treated just like her and who have no choice. That photograph raised the consciousness immediately. You see that photograph and you cannot look away from it. It doesn't say America. Lewis Hine's stark photographs influenced legislation over a period of roughly 35 years. This body of work on child labor represented how he thought and how he felt that children must not be exploited. He represents the most important photographer in terms of social advocacy and social change in the first half of the 20th century.
Now, what's really interesting here is that Lewis Hine seemed to have more of a political agenda than many of the muckrakers. So again, this is saying, this is a bit biased, but it's saying that Lewis Hine had the most impact. Jacob Riis and his family probably would argue the other way, but Lewis Hine was, again, trying to get laws passed, whereas Jacob Riis in some ways was trying to sell his books, okay? So again, in the same way that Jane Addams said, it's the environment that is the problem. We got to fix the environment. Progressive reformers said, if children don't have to deal with harmful environments, they can grow up to be, productive adults. But if they're in these harmful environments, they'll be stunted, they'll be maimed. Right here on the page are all these injuries from a report that if you looked at, the examination of these girls from different factories, and different boys, all the injuries that they sustained. Okay. Now, I want to take us now from children being exploited really to immigrant women being exploited. Famously or infamously, we have the Triangle Shirtwaist Fire in 1911 in New York City.
The Triangle Shirtwaist Factory fire was a man-made disaster, a tragedy of the industrial age, made all the worse because it could have been prevented. Let me set the scene. New York City, early 20th century. The Triangle Shirtwaist Factory occupied several floors of a Manhattan business building called the Ash Building. It was located just off Washington Square Park, one of the wealthiest neighborhoods in the city. The Triangle Shirtwaist Factory was, by almost any definition, a sweatshop. It was a densely packed place. Some 500 people worked there, and the work schedule was punishing. 11 to 12 hours a day, every day. Most of the people employed at the factory were young immigrant women, teenagers even, who didn't speak English. These women sat at long tables, day in, day out, sewing shirtwaists. Shirtwaists were mass-produced blouses. They resembled men's shirts and were very popular with working women. So here's what happened. March 25th, 1911, Saturday evening, the end of the workday, the work week. A fire started in a bin of cotton scraps, perhaps from a cigarette butt. A manager tried to use a hose to put it out, but the hose valve was rusted shut, and the hose itself was rotted away. The factory floor didn't have a sprinkler system, so the fire spread quickly. People panicked. The building had only one flimsy fire escape, and it wasn't nearly big enough. It collapsed. The building had 4 elevators, but only one was working, and it only held 12 people at a time. It managed to make 4 rescue trips before it broke down. Some desperate workers jumped to their deaths down the elevator shaft. Workers tried to take the stairs, but the exit doors only opened inward, and they were kept locked by factory management. Many people were crushed to death trying to get out. Firefighting technology hadn't caught up to the new tall buildings of a city like New York. The fire hoses and ladders could only reach the 7th floor, 1 floor short of the fire. Dozens of desperate workers jumped out of the windows. They chose to die from the fall instead of the flames. Other workers burned to death or died from smoke inhalation. The whole episode lasted just 18 minutes. 144 people were dead. 2 more died later in the hospital, bringing the death toll to 146. Until the events of September 11th, it was the deadliest workplace disaster in New York City history. Days later, on April 5th, a massive funeral protest march took place on 5th Avenue in Manhattan. More than 350,000 people were in attendance. The factory owners, Max Planck and Isaac Harris, were indicted for manslaughter, but were declared not guilty in their trial later that year. Yet, long after the flames died out, the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory fire served as a cautionary tale that helped to redefine the American industrial workplace. The fire was...
Okay. So again, terribly tragic, definitely could have been prevented. One of the problems was that the owners didn't want people stealing or taking breaks, so they'd lock the doors. So when the fire broke out, there was really no way for people to get out. You saw that the firefighting technology wasn't advanced enough. Now, what's interesting here is there was a big outcry. You saw 350,000 people protesting, but it really didn't create any national groundswell for changes in workplace safety. It was New York passed some workplace safety, but even with something this tragic, you didn't necessarily always see the federal government jumping in. So that goes again to this idea that the federal government is still sort of hands off despite this particular tragedy. Now, I want to look at the federal government with 3 specific Supreme Court decisions. Now, we actually addressed Lochner earlier in some reading questions, but it's a really interesting case because it completely goes against the progressive era. So in this particular case, you have the state of New York created basically a ceiling on hours that anybody, bakers particularly, could work in New York, which is like really good for labor. That's of course part of the Holy Trinity. They want to reduce hours. But basically the bosses are like, well, that's ridiculous. You can't put a limit on hours because that would make it so that if a worker wanted to work for 24 hours, they couldn't make as much money as possible. And the Supreme Court actually ruled that was true, that in fact, states couldn't do that because in the end, it sort of, undermined the capitalist system. Well, that was in 1905. It's considered, again, sort of up there with like Plessy v. Ferguson and Dred Scott as some of the most backwards cases. But you're going to see in 1908 on a completely different side of the country over in Oregon, you're going to see the Mueller versus Oregon decision, which is in many ways a win and a loss at the same time. So it ruled that maximum hours for women specifically were legal because they had a special condition, both a physical and psychological makeup that made them different from men. So you could have laws because, again, they were more vulnerable and therefore needed to be protected. But in the long run, by declaring that women were somehow different, it made it hard to argue that they were actually equal later on. So it helped women in the moment, but sort of in the greater sort of feminist women's equality mission, it didn't. Okay, so there's not a really good mnemonic there. I tried to bring in Munn. They're both wins for the little guy or gal. But now, just about a decade later, in Bunting versus Oregon, men and women are seen as being okay to have basically maximum hour laws. So we start with Lochner, which is sort of bizarre and antithetical to the progressive era, but Mueller and Bunting both really help provide that maximum hours, which again is what labor wants. Now, I'm going to go quickly to food safety here because I think in many ways the food safety part actually plays in with the workplace conditions. And we finally are at Jurgis. I know you've been waiting. This is the Jurgis I've always been talking about. Now, he's a fictional character, Jurgis Rodkis. He is an Eastern European worker in Packingtown, which is what Upton Sinclair was writing about for the meatpacking district of Chicago.
In Chicago, throughout much of the 20th century, a rugged limestone gate marked the entrance to the heart of the nation's meatpacking industry, before officially closing in 1971. The Union Stockyard Gate survives as a visual reminder of Chicago's former reign in livestock and meatpacking, one that earned it the nickname Hog Butcher to the World. By the mid-1800s, the hub of the nation's meatpacking industry was centralizing in Chicago.
Chicago sits in an incredibly rich hinterland where the hogs and the cattle are being raised. And then you couple that with Chicago becoming the railroad center for the middle part of the country, if not the whole of the country. And then a third piece of this will kick in to get a sense of why Chicago and why at this time period, and that is it's going to be a lot of unskilled labor that's going to be needed in these processing plants, and that unskilled labor can get to Chicago pretty easily along the railroads.
A universe unto itself. The stockyards, feedlots, slaughterhouses, and meat processing plants, together with nearby worker housing, would become known as Packingtown. Days in the stockyards were long, and work in the slaughterhouses was grueling. Working for just pennies an hour, unskilled immigrant laborers wielded sledgehammers and knives in dark and unventilated rooms. In 1904, the Meatpackers Union in Chicago went on strike. That brought a largely unknown writer for a socialist magazine named Upton Sinclair to Chicago. He came to investigate workers' allegations about the conditions in Packingtown. Sinclair spent 6 months interviewing workers and their families and spent time in the meatpacking plants. His resulting book, The Jungle, revealed so much more than he had planned.
The book does chronicle the tough working conditions that the workers face. It does chronicle the problems of housing in the neighborhood and the overcrowding in the neighborhood around back of the yards. But the real impact of the Jungle's book on the American public is an overall repugnance of the food processing that's going on in back of the yards and the food that's coming to their own tables.
Sinclair wrote about diseased, rotten, and contaminated meat doctored by chemicals and mislabeled for sale to the public. And about sausage, piled on a dirty floor before workers carried it off in carts, holding human urine, rat feces, and in some cases, dead rats.
Upton Sinclair and other muckraking journalists like Upton Sinclair really offered Chicagoans and the country as a whole an inside view on a world that most people weren't going to see, and that reminded people to think long and hard about where the food was that was on their table.
So it's interesting. This is a movie that was made. The wonderful story of the beef packaging industry. By no means did Upton Sinclair mean to write a wonderful story. And, this is a picture of Jurgis Rodkis right here. He's a fictional character. Who knows if that's what he actually looked like. But Upton Sinclair famously made this quote. He said, "I aimed for the public's heart and hit it in the stomach." And what he meant was, I went there to try to show how bad capitalism was. I was trying to appeal to this socialist sort of heart, but instead I hit him in the stomach. So he didn't ever intend for this to be all about how bad the meat was. He was trying to show that the meat was bad because corporate America was bad, because capitalism was bad. So it's really interesting that it came with a socialist lens, and that's not the impact that it had. Instead, the impact was on Congress and ultimately on Teddy Roosevelt, who was president at the time. So the Jungle is going to result in some major legislative action, the Meat Inspection Act and the Pure Food and Drug Act. So if you look at this cartoon, you can see just the concern about what people were consuming, that it wasn't being labeled correctly, that it was contaminated. So this is a classic case where a muckraker was trying to point out, one problem, and it resulted in certainly a solution, but that was not necessarily his goal.